Fort Worth, Texas, August 1976. A 24-year-old engineer named Steve Leininger is sitting at a workbench on the second floor of the RadioShack headquarters building on Tandy Boulevard. In front of him, a Zilog Z80 processor mounted on a hand-wired circuit board, a keyboard stripped from a teletype machine, and a black and white television he is using as a monitor. The processor runs at 1.77 megahertz. The system has 4 kilobytes of memory. The entire assembly is held together by solder joints he made himself, one at a time over the past 6 months. He is building something that does not exist yet. Not a kit, not a project. A product, a computer that a person with no engineering degree could pick up in a store, bring home and use. Something finished, something real. He does not know that what he is building will outsell Apple 3-1. He does not know it will put more Americans in front of a computer screen than any other machine in history. He does not know that the company he is building it for will one day look at what he made and decide to sell its competitor's machine instead. He is just trying to get the keyboard to stop dropping characters. The story of the TRS-80 does not begin with Steve Leininger. It begins with a man named Don French. French was a buyer at RadioShack, the person responsible for deciding which products the chain would carry in its stores. In 1975 and 1976, French had been watching something happening in California that nobody in Fort Worth seemed to understand. In garages and community centers around the Bay Area, a loosely organized group of engineers and hobbyists called the Homebrew Computer Club were building personal computers from kits and scratch components. Steve Jobs was there. Steve Wozniak was there. Steve Leininger was there too, building his own machines after hours, learning the architecture of the Z80 processor the way a musician learns an instrument, not from a textbook, but from handling it until it became instinct. French saw the Altair 8800 sell out its first production run in 30 days. He saw the MITS kit computer generate more mail order interest than any electronics product since the transistor radio. He understood what this meant in a way that most retail executives did not. The personal computer was not a hobbyist curiosity. It was a consumer product waiting for someone to finish it, to take the raw technical capability that the homebrew engineers were assembling in their garages and put it in a box that a man who had never soldered a circuit board in his life could buy on a Saturday morning and bring home. He took the idea to Charles Tandy. Tandy listened. Then he told French to find somebody who could build it. French found Leininger. Leininger had worked at National Semiconductor. He was, crucially, a member of the Homebrew Computer Club, the same community producing Jobs and Wozniak 50 miles away. When French hired him and brought him to Fort Worth, RadioShack had something Apple did not. 8,000 stores in every state. Staff who could demonstrate products to customers who had never seen a computer. A customer base of millions who already trusted RadioShack with their electronics purchases. Apple had 2 engineers in a garage and a prototype they were still arguing about. RadioShack had 8,000 stores and a 24-year-old who knew exactly how to build the machine. Leininger built it 6 months at the workbench in Fort Worth. When he demonstrated the finished prototype to Charles Tandy in February 1977, Tandy sat down at the keyboard and typed in his own salary. The computer crashed. The machine used 16-bit integers and could not process any number above 32,000. Tandy earned more than that. They fixed it. On August 3, 1977, RadioShack unveiled the TRS-80 at a press conference in Manhattan. Price? $599 with the monitor included. The same year, Apple released the Apple II for $1,298, the Commodore PET for $795. The TRS-80 was the cheapest personal computer available, and it was the only one you could buy in a store that already existed in your town. Before we go further, drop a comment with where you're watching from and subscribe if you're new. Now, the RadioShack executives expected to sell 3,000 units a year. Leininger believed 50,000 was possible. John Roach, who would later become chief executive, described his reaction to that projection in his own words as unprintable. The backup plan, if nobody bought them, was simple. Each RadioShack store could use one to manage its own inventory. At least they would not go to waste. They sold 10,000 the first month. The phone system at headquarters crashed from the order volume. By the end of the first year, over 100,000 TRS-80s had shipped. That was half of every personal computer sold in the United States in 1978. Half. By 1979, RadioShack owned 40% of the personal computer market. Apple had approximately 12%. IBM had not yet entered. There was no IBM PC. There was no Microsoft DOS. There was the TRS-80 in 8,000 stores, being carried home by electricians and accountants and teachers and teenagers experiencing a computer for the first time in their lives. The machine had real limitations. The keyboard dropped keystrokes under pressure. Cassette tape storage was slow and unreliable. Saving a program could take 10 minutes and fail silently. erasing everything without warning. The display showed only uppercase characters. The expansion interface required for disk drives and additional memory, connected through a bus that worked the way a car with a bent frame works. Technically, under protest, the hobbyist community had a name for it, the Trash 80. The name spread through the computer magazines, multiplying in the late 1970s. Through the same homebrew community Leininger had come from, through the letters columns of Byte and Creative Computing, where engineers who owned Apple IIs measured the TRS-80 against their preferred machine and found it wanting. The nickname was a technical critique from specialists. It became, through repetition, the machine's public identity. But the Trash 80 nickname obscured something important. The engineers calling it the Trash 80 were not the market. The market was the man who had never owned a computer, who walked into his local RadioShack on a Saturday morning because it was the only place in his town where he could look at a personal computer, touch it, and ask someone what it did. For that man, the TRS-80 was not competing with the Apple II. It was competing with nothing. It was the only option, and for him, it was winning. By 1980, RadioShack was selling 3 times as many computers as Apple. Time magazine called the TRS-80 the largest selling computer of all time. The educational market was enormous. Schools that could not afford Apple IIs were buying TRS-80s by the classroom. VisiCalc, the spreadsheet program that would later be credited with making the personal computer a business tool, had a TRS-80 version. WordStar ran on TRS-80. Basic programmers learning to code for the first time were learning on TRS-80. There were more software titles available for the TRS-80 than for any other personal computer in the world. Then, in November 1978, 4 months after the TRS-80 launched, Charles Tandy died. Heart attack. He was 60 years old. He had not lived to see the sales numbers Leininger's machine would generate. He had not seen the teachers using it in classrooms, the programmers learning to code on it, the small businesses running their accounts on it. He died believing he had approved a useful retail product. He never knew he had approved the foundation of an industry. The man who inherited the company, John Roach, a capable executive who had been with RadioShack since 1967, inherited the TRS-80. At the moment, it was about to change everything. Roach understood retail. He understood the RadioShack store model, the franchise structure, the catalog business that had made Charles Tandy rich. What he did not share was Tandy's instinct for what a product was becoming rather than what it was. RadioShack was about to make the most expensive mistake in the history of consumer electronics. It was about to treat its platform like a product. In August 1981, IBM released the IBM Personal Computer. It ran an operating system called PC-DOS, licensed from a small Seattle software company called Microsoft. The IBM PC was not technically superior to the TRS-80 Model 3, which had been on the market since 1980. It was not cheaper, it was not available in more locations. What it had was a name, IBM, the company that ran the computers in every bank and corporation in America, and an open architecture that allowed any manufacturer to build compatible machines and any developer to write software for it without IBM's permission. The press anointed the IBM PC as the machine that would define business computing. The computer magazines that had spent 4 years calling the TRS-80 the Trash 80 now declared the IBM standard the only standard that mattered. Within 18 months of the IBM PC's release, the narrative of the personal computer industry had been rewritten around a machine that had not existed 2 years earlier. The TRS-80 was still selling. The Model 3 had fixed the keyboard, replaced the cassette storage with disk drives, added lowercase characters. The Model 4, released in 1983, was faster and more capable than anything RadioShack had sold before. The educational market was still buying. The small business market was still buying. Developers were still writing software for it. But the press had decided. The developers were looking at the IBM PC and seeing a larger market, a more open architecture, a platform with momentum. And John Roach, reading the same magazine coverage as everyone else, drew a conclusion that felt rational in 1982 and looks catastrophic in retrospect. RadioShack would not compete with IBM. It would carry IBM. The company that had invented the personal computer retail market would stock its competitor's machine on its own shelves. It was the moment RadioShack stopped believing in what it had built. The rest followed with the logic of a building that has lost its foundation. In 1983, RadioShack began selling the IBM PC in its stores alongside the TRS-80. The message to every customer who walked in was unambiguous. Here is the machine the industry has chosen, and here is our machine. The comparison destroyed whatever credibility the TRS-80 had retained among customers who knew enough to compare. The customers who didn't know enough to compare didn't need to. The salesman behind the counter knew which machine his company believed in. Software development for TRS-80 slowed as developers moved to the IBM-compatible market. Educational institutions that had bought TRS-80s began planning transitions to Apple and IBM. Small businesses running their accounts on TRS-80 Basic began replacing their machines. Each defection made the next defection more likely, the platform dynamic working in reverse, the ecosystem contracting around a machine its own manufacturer had publicly abandoned. By 1985, RadioShack had discontinued the TRS-80 line. The machine that had owned 40% of the personal computer market 6 years earlier was gone. Apple had won, IBM had won. Microsoft, which had licensed DOS to IBM while retaining the right to license the same software to every IBM-compatible manufacturer, was about to win in a way that would make everything else look small. The Trash 80 was dead. The better machines had won. That is the story. That is not the whole story. RadioShack had 8,000 stores in 1981. Apple had 0 retail locations. IBM sold through corporate accounts and authorized dealers. A distribution network, a fraction of RadioShack's size. You do not lose a retail distribution advantage that large to a better product. You surrender it. The TRS-80 was not killed by the IBM PC. The IBM PC did not exist until 4 years after the TRS-80 launched. During those 4 years, RadioShack owned the personal computer market. The machine that replaced the TRS-80 in RadioShack's own stores was not more advanced than what RadioShack had already built. It was a machine RadioShack chose to believe in instead of the machine it had already made. The question is not why the market chose IBM over TRS-80. The question is why RadioShack did. Charles Tandy understood something about products that his successors did not. He had spent his career building categories, not selling into markets that already existed, but creating markets that didn't. The personal computer was not the first time he had recognized a technology before it was ready and committed to it before the outcome was clear. He had done it with high-fidelity stereo in the 1960s. He had done it with scientific calculators in the early 1970s. He had done it with CB radios. Investing in the category before the trucking boom made CB radios a national phenomenon, and then being positioned to capture the market when the boom arrived. Tandy's genius was not technical, it was perceptual. He understood what a product was becoming before the market confirmed it. When he approved the TRS-80 project, he was not approving a new entry in the consumer electronics catalog. He was approving a bet on a category, the same kind of bet that had built everything he had. When Tandy died in November 1978, the TRS-80 was 4 months old. It had sold 10,000 units in its first month. The pressure on the company's distribution and manufacturing systems was unlike anything RadioShack had experienced. The men who inherited his company, competent executives who had learned their business from Tandy, did not share his instinct for what the TRS-80 was becoming. John Roach looked at the TRS-80 and saw a product in a category. Successful product, profitable product, a product that required ongoing development and marketing investment and software ecosystem management and platform strategy, all of which were things RadioShack's operational structure was not designed to do. Because RadioShack had been built to sell products, not to build platforms. The distinction sounds abstract. It was not. A product succeeds or fails based on its specifications relative to the competition. You improve the product, you sell more units, you compete on features and price. A platform succeeds or fails based on the size of the ecosystem surrounding it. The software, the peripherals, the developers, the institutional buyers who have standardized on it, the students who learned on it and will spend their careers buying the machines they trust. Platform competition is not won by the best machine. It is won by the machine with the largest committed ecosystem. In 1979, that machine was the TRS-80, not because it was the best machine technically, because it was in 40% of homes and schools and offices that owned a personal computer, because there were more software titles written for it than for any other machine, because the developers who were learning their craft in 1979 were learning it on TRS-80. RadioShack had the platform. It never understood what that meant. The software ecosystem is where the story becomes specific and the consequences become irreversible. In 1979, there were more software titles available for TRS-80 than for any other personal computer. More games, more business applications, more educational programs, more programming tools. The reason was straightforward. Developers wrote software for the machines people owned, and more people owned TRS-80s than owned anything else. The ecosystem was self-reinforcing. More machines meant more software meant more machines. Platform dynamics, building momentum. VisiCalc, the spreadsheet program historians credit with making the personal computer a business tool rather than a hobbyist toy, was released for the Apple II in October 1979. It was released for TRS-80 in 1980. Both versions worked. Businesses bought both. Small companies that had been running handwritten ledgers moved to personal computers and spreadsheets in the same purchase decision. What most technology histories get wrong about VisiCalc is the causal direction. VisiCalc did not make the Apple II the dominant business computer. VisiCalc made personal computers business tools, and whichever machine was positioned as the serious business option at the moment that perception crystallized would take the market. In 1979 and 1980, that machine should have been the TRS-80. It had the distribution, it had the installed base, it had the software. What it did not have was a platform strategy. Apple, under Steve Jobs, understood platform strategy at a level that RadioShack never approached. When VisiCalc became the Apple II's defining application, Apple doubled down. They cultivated developer relationships. They made it easier to write software for the Apple II. They managed their press relationships carefully, letting the Trash 80 nickname circulate without correction, reinforcing the perception that Apple was the serious machine and TRS-80 was the hobbyist toy. The nickname had originated as a technical critique from engineers. Apple's marketing team was content to let it define the public understanding of the competition. RadioShack's response was to release the Model 2. The Model 2 was a business-oriented machine, a separate product line, priced above the Model 1, aimed at the small business market that VisiCalc had opened. The product decision was reasonable, the architectural decision was catastrophic. The Model 2 was incompatible with Model 1 software. Developers who had spent years writing applications for the Model 1 could not sell them to Model 2 buyers without rewriting everything from scratch. Buyers who had standardized on TRS-80 Model 1 found that upgrading to the business machine meant abandoning the software library they had built. RadioShack had fragmented its own platform, not maliciously, but with the same result as malice. The software ecosystem that had been the TRS-80's greatest competitive advantage had been split in two by a product decision that treated compatibility as optional. Across the country in Seattle, a 23-year-old named Bill Gates was watching. Gates had understood earlier than almost anyone that the personal computer industry would ultimately be decided not at the hardware level, but at the software level. The company that controlled the operating system would control the platform because developers wrote for operating systems, not for chips. Gates had sold a BASIC interpreter to RadioShack for the TRS-80. He had sold BASIC to Commodore. He had sold BASIC to Apple. He was writing software for every machine, building relationships with every manufacturer, positioning himself to capture the moment when one operating system could standardize the industry. When IBM came to Gates in 1980, looking for an operating system for the machine they were building, Gates acquired QDOS, a quick and dirty operating system written by a Seattle programmer named Tim Patterson, and licensed it to IBM as PC-DOS, retaining the right to license the identical software to other manufacturers as MS-DOS. Every IBM-compatible machine that followed would run the same operating system. Gates had not built the best product. He had secured the layer beneath the product. RadioShack had 8,000 stores and a 4-year head start. Microsoft had an operating system license and the patience to wait. Gates understood which one would matter more. The decision that ended the TRS-80 was made in Fort Worth, Texas, sometime in 1982. The specific meeting is not on record the way product launches are on record. There is no press release marking the exact moment RadioShack's leadership decided to carry the IBM PC rather than continue developing the platform Steve Leininger had built. What is documented is the consequence. In the spring of 1983, RadioShack began stocking the IBM PC. The decision was framed publicly as an expansion of RadioShack's computer offering. More choice for customers, recognition that the industry was converging on the IBM standard. Internally, the logic was sound. IBM had corporate credibility that RadioShack could not quickly build, and carrying IBM machines would bring business customers into RadioShack stores who had previously bought through corporate channels. What the decision communicated to developers, to institutional buyers, to the press, to the engineers at RadioShack, who had spent 6 years building the TRS-80, was that RadioShack had looked at its own computer and concluded it was not good enough. The company that had invented the personal computer retail market had decided the machine it invented was not worth defending. Steve Leininger left RadioShack in 1982. He had spent 6 years building the TRS-80 from a hand-wired prototype on a workbench to the best-selling personal computer in American history. He had watched the Model 2 fragment the platform. He had watched the press consolidate around Apple and IBM. While the machine he designed was defined by a nickname the hobbyist community had given it in 1977, he had built something that had introduced more Americans to computing than any engineer in history. And the company he built it for had decided to sell its competitor's machine instead. He took a job elsewhere. He kept his prototype. What RadioShack lost when it abandoned the TRS-80 was not a product line. It was the installed base, the hundreds of thousands of users who had standardized on TRS-80, the developers writing software for it, the schools that had bought it for classrooms, the small businesses that had built operations around it. All of those users were eventually going to upgrade. The question was what they would upgrade to. If RadioShack had maintained platform compatibility across model generations, kept the software library intact, cultivated the developer ecosystem, competed on distribution and price and the existing installed base, those users upgrade to a new TRS 80. Their software still works, their institutional knowledge transfers, the platform grows. Instead, RadioShack told them it was over, and every one of those users took their upgrade decision to Apple or to an IBM-compatible machine running MS-DOS. They took their software budgets and their institutional contracts and their brand loyalty to a different ecosystem. They never came back. The engineers who learned to code on TRS 80s went on to build the industry RadioShack abandoned. This is not a metaphor. The personal computers of the late 1970s and early 1980s were the training ground for the generation that built the next 30 years of technology. The programmers writing TRS 80 BASIC in their bedrooms in 1979 were the developers shipping software for the web in 1995 and mobile platforms in 2005. The educators teaching on TRS 80 in 1980 were producing the engineers who staffed Amazon and Google and Microsoft in the 2000s. RadioShack had those engineers first. It had them in the only sense that matters in platform competition, before they became engineers. It had them as children and teenagers and young adults having their first experience with a computer on a machine RadioShack had made and sold and supported. The loyalty that early adopters of a platform carry into their professional lives, the instinct to develop for the machine you learned on, to buy what you trust, to recommend what you understand. RadioShack had earned that loyalty completely, and then it had voluntarily surrendered it. Apple understood what RadioShack did not. The Apple II in Education program, launched in the early 1980s, placed Apple computers in schools at reduced cost for exactly this reason. The 10-year-old who learns to code on an Apple IIs becomes the 25-year-old who develops for the Mac, becomes the 40-year-old who buys his children iPhones. The platform investment is generational. You do not measure its return in the quarter it is made. You measure it 20 years later, when the engineers who learned on your machine are running the companies that decide which platforms their organizations buy. RadioShack made that investment for 6 years. Then it walked away from it, stocked its competitor's machine, and watched the engineers it had trained take their loyalty somewhere else. The 8,000 stores did not save it. The distribution network that Apple and IBM would each spend decades trying to replicate did not save it. The stores remained, the customers remained. What was gone was the product that had earned their trust, and the institutional conviction that RadioShack's own machine was worth the fight. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy in February 2015. The assets were sold. The brand passed through owners of diminishing credibility, each of whom purchased a name without understanding what the name had once represented. The company that owned 40% of the personal computer market in 1979 ended as a trademark on a package, licensed to a retail chain in El Salvador, displayed at a trade show in Las Vegas by people who had never met Charles Tandy, who had never touched a TRS-80, who could not have known what the name had meant, to a generation of Americans who discovered what a computer was on a machine that cost $599 and crashed when you typed in a number too large. Fort Worth, Texas, sometime in 2024, Steve Leininger is retired. He has given interviews over the years to technology historians, to podcast hosts, to journalists writing retrospectives on the personal computer era. He answers the questions carefully. He remembers the workbench, he remembers the borrowed teletype keyboard and the hand-wired circuit board and the Z80 processor running at 1.77 megahertz. He still has the prototype, the original hand-built machine he demonstrated to Charles Tandy in February 1977, the machine that crashed when Tandy typed in his salary, the machine Leininger fixed, that became the best-selling computer in the United States, that put more Americans in front of a screen than any other machine in history, that RadioShack had first and understood last. It is in a box, the computer that could have made RadioShack what Apple became, the machine that outsold Apple 3-1 and handed Apple the time it needed to become what it became, in a box, in a retired engineer's home, because he built it with his own hands when he was 24 years old, and he could not bring himself to throw it away.